on Jekyll Island, Georgia, to form a new banking cartel with the express purpose of forming the third bank of the United States, with the aim of placing complete control of the United States money supply once again under the control of private bankers. Owing to hostility over the previous banks of the United States, the name of this third bank was changed to the Federal Reserve, in order to grant the new bank a quasi-governmental image. But in fact, it is a privately owned bank. It's no more federal than Federal Express. In fact, last year, the Federal Reserve successfully rebuffed a Freedom of Information lawsuit by Bloomberg News on the grounds that as a private banking corporation, and not actually a part of the U.S. government, the Freedom of Information Act did not apply to the operators of the Federal Reserve. So 1913 proved to be a transformative year for the nation's economy. First, with Congress' passage of the 16th Income Tax Amendment and the false claim it had been ratified. Here's another direct quote. I think if you were to go back and try and find and review the ratification for the 16th Amendment, which was the internal revenue, the income tax, I think if you went back and examined that carefully, you would find that a sufficient number of states never ratified that amendment, end quote. That's U.S. District Court Judge James C. Fox in Sullivan versus United States, 2003. Later that same year, 1913, and apparently unwilling to risk another questionable amendment, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act over the Christmas holiday in 1913, while members of Congress opposed to the measure were at home. This was a very underhanded deal, as the Constitution explicitly vests Congress with the authority to issue the public currency, does not authorize its delegation, and thus would have required a new amendment to transfer that authority to a private bank. But pass it, Congress did, and President Woodrow Wilson signed it as he promised the bankers he would in exchange for generous campaign contributions. Now, President Wilson later regretted that decision. You've probably heard this quote before, but you're going to get it again. Quote, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." That was Woodrow Wilson writing in 1919. Now, 1 year after the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, World War I started, and it is important to remember that prior to the creation of the Federal Reserve, there was no such thing as a world war. Now, World War I actually started between Austria, Hungary, and Serbia, but quickly shifted to focus on Germany. Why Germany? They didn't start the war. Why was Germany the villain in World War I? Well, the real reason was their industrial capacity was seen as an economic threat to Great Britain. Great Britain's pound was already in decline at the time because too much economic emphasis was on banking and finance, and not enough was on agricultural development, industrial development, and infrastructure. It's very much like the situation we have in the United States right now. All the financial operatives, they want to play the Wall Street games, and other parts of the economy are being neglected. We've lost a great deal of our manufacturing. We're not the agricultural exporter we used to be because everybody's over there at Wall Street playing in that giant open-air casino. Now, pre-war Germany did have a private central bank, but it was under strict control by the German government to keep inflation at reasonable levels and to make sure that all of the German economy was being properly funded, just like Putin did with their central bank about a month ago. Under government control by the German government, investment was guaranteed to internal economic development, and as a result, Germany had become a major manufacturing technological power. They were exporting products that Great Britain could not compete with. So in the media of the day, Germany was portrayed as the main opponent of World War I. And not just defeated, it was flattened. Now, following the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was ordered to pay the war costs of all the participating nations, even though Germany had not started that war. This amounted to 3 times the value of all of Germany itself. Germany's private central bank, to which the German government had gone deeply into debt to pay the cost of the wars, was allowed to break free of government control. That led to the massive inflation of the Weimar Republic, followed, permanently trapping the German people in endless debt. And money speculators were running rampant, and it led to these situations where you had literally a whole basket full of paper notes to get a loaf of bread. Now, when the Weimar Republic collapsed economically, it opened the door for the National Socialists to take power. Their first financial move was to issue their own state currency, which was not borrowed from private central banks. It was based on a unit of value, not a unit of debt. Freed from having to pay interest on the money in circulation, Germany blossomed and quickly began to rebuild its industry. It was an amazing transformation to see. The media called it the German miracle. Time magazine lionized Hitler for the amazing improvement of life for the German people and the explosion of German industry, and they even named him Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1938. And then once again, Germany's prosperity and freedom from a private central bank loaning the public currency at interest became a threat to other nations and other powers. I have a couple of quotes here from Winston Churchill that tells you what was really going through the minds of Europe in the years leading up to World War II. Quote, "Should Germany merchandise again," which means do business, "should Germany merchandise again in the next 50 years, we have led this war, World War I, in vain." That was Winston Churchill writing in the Times in 1919. Another quote, quote, "We will force this war upon Hitler if he wants it or not," end quote. Winston Churchill in a 1936 radio broadcast. Quote, "Germany becomes too powerful. We have to crush it," end quote. Winston Churchill in November 1936 speaking to U.S. General Robert Wood. Quote, "This war is an English war, and its goal is the destruction of Germany." Winston Churchill, autumn 1939 broadcast. So it was all about economics and profitability. Now, Germany's state-issued value-based currency was also a direct threat to the wealth and power of the private central banks around the world. And as early as 1933, they started to organize a global boycott against Germany to strangle this upstart ruler who thought he could run his nation without a private central bank. Now, as had been the case in World War I, Great Britain and other nations threatened by Germany's economic power looked for an excuse to go to war. And as public anger in Germany grew over the boycott, Hitler foolishly gave them that excuse. Years later, in a spirit of candor, the real reasons for the war were made clear. Quote, "The war wasn't only about abolishing fascism, but to conquer sales markets. We could have, if we had intended so, prevented this war from breaking out without doing one shot, but we didn't want to," end quote. Winston Churchill to Harry Truman, March 1946. One more quote here. Quote, "Germany's unforgivable crime before World War II was its attempt to loosen its economy out of the world trade system and to build up an independent exchange system from which the world finance couldn't profit anymore. We butchered the wrong pig," end quote. Winston Churchill writing in his book, The Second World War. Now, a little side note, we're going to actually step back in time to the years before World War II. A little bit of history a lot of Americans are still completely unaware of. And it involves a gentleman by the name of Marine Corps Major General Smedley Butler. In 1933, Wall Street bankers and financiers had bankrolled the successful rise to power of Hitler and Mussolini. Brown Brothers Harriman in New York, and they're still there. I saw them when I was there for the 9/11 anniversary. They were financing Hitler right up to the day war was declared with Germany. And these Wall Street financiers decided that a fascist dictatorship in the United States, based on the one Mussolini had in Italy, was going to be far better for their business interests than Roosevelt's New Deal, which threatened massive wealth redistribution to recapitalize the working and middle classes of America. So the Wall Street tycoons recruited General Butler to lead the overthrow of the U.S. government and install a Secretary of General Affairs who would be answerable to Wall Street and not the people, would crush social unrest and shut down all the labor unions. General Butler pretended to go along with the scheme, but then exposed the plot to Congress. So they recruited Marine Corps Major General Smedley Butler to lead this coup d'etat, because Butler was very popular with the soldiers, and his image as part of this move would help convince the military this was the right thing to do. Now, to his credit, Major General Smedley Butler, remembering his oath to the Constitution, pretended to go along with the scheme, but then exposed the plot to the United States Congress. Congress, then as now in the pocket of Wall Street bankers, refused to act. When Roosevelt learned of the planned coup, he demanded the arrest of the plotters, but the plotters simply reminded Roosevelt that if any one of them were sent to prison, their friends on Wall Street would deliberately collapse the still fragile U.S. economy and blame Roosevelt for it. So Roosevelt was unable to do anything about this attempted coup d'etat until the start of World War II, at which time he prosecuted many of the plotters under the Trading with the Enemy Act. Now, mostly it was glossed over. Oh, it's just a rumor, unfounded, it's wacko conspiracy theory. But in 1967, the congressional minutes of Smedley Butler's revelation to Congress of the coup were finally released to the public. You ever see this movie, 7 Days in May, Kirk Douglas and Burt Lancaster, about an attempted military takeover of the United States of America? It was based loosely on this story. But of course, in the movie, the bankers being behind the Burt Lancaster character was completely removed from the script here. Now, Smedley Butler is also famous for writing a work called War is a Racket. And I would like to read you a quote from that. Quote, I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service as a member of our country's most agile military force, the Marine Corps. I served in all commissioned ranks from second lieutenant to major general. And during that period, I spent more of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I suspected I was just part of a racket at the time. Now I'm sure of it. Like all members of the military profession, I never had an original thought until after I left the service. My mental faculties remained in suspended animation while I obeyed the orders of the higher-ups. This is typical with everyone in the military service. Thus, I helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. The record of racketeering is long. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909 through 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that the Standard Oil went its way unmolested. During those years, I had, as the boys in the back room would say, a swell racket. I was rewarded with honors, medals, and promotion. Looking back on it, I feel I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 city districts. I operated on 3 continents. General Smedley Butler, former U.S. Marine Corps Commandant, and he wrote that in 1935. So, now moving forward here. As president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy understood the predatory nature of private central banking. He understood why Andrew Jackson fought so hard to end the Second Bank of the United States. So Kennedy wrote and signed Executive Order 11110, which ordered the U.S. Treasury to issue a new public currency called the United States Note. Now, Kennedy's United States notes were not borrowed from the Federal Reserve. They were created by the U.S. government and backed by the silver stockpiles held by the U.S. government. It represented a return to the system of economics the United States had been founded on, and it was perfectly legal for Kennedy to do so under the Constitution. All told, some $4.5 billion went into the public circulation, which eroded interest payments to the Federal Reserve and loosened their control over the nation. 5 months after signing Executive Order 11110, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and the United States notes pulled from circulation and destroyed. Following Kennedy's assassination, John J. McCloy, president of the Chase Manhattan Bank and president of the World Bank, was named to the Warren Commission. Now, I don't care how good a banker he is, he's not qualified to be investigating a murder, which is what we were told the Warren Commission was all about, to get the truth of the assassination. But we all know that the Warren Commission was there to cover up what was going on, and obviously we can presume safely that John J. McCloy's presence on the Warren Commission was to make sure the American public never got even a hint of the financial dimensions behind the assassination. So, as we enter the 11th year of what I am certain future history will most certainly describe as World War III, we need to examine the financial dimensions behind all these wars. Why are we here? Why are our children being killed and crippled? Is this another war for the profit of the private central bankers? And the answer is yes. Now, toward the end of World War II, when it became obvious that the Allies were going to win and dictate the post-war political environment, the major world economic powers met at Bretton Woods, a luxury resort in New Hampshire, in July of 1944, and they hammered out the Bretton Woods Agreement for International Finance. The British pound lost its position as the global trade and reserve currency to the U.S. dollar. There are indications this was part of the price demanded by Roosevelt in exchange for the U.S. entry into the war. Now, absent the economic advantages of being the world's go-to currency, Britain was forced to nationalize their Bank of England in 1946. The Bretton Woods Agreement, ratified in 1945, in addition to making the dollar the global reserve and trade currency, obligated the signatory nations to tie their currencies to the dollar. The nations that ratified Bretton Woods did so on 2 conditions. The first was that the Federal Reserve would refrain from overprinting the dollar, basically as a means to loot real products and produce from other nations in exchange for ink and paper. It basically was an imperial tax imposed by the U.S. economic system on the rest of the world. That assurance of no overprinting was supposedly backed up by the second requirement, which was that the U.S. dollar would always be convertible back to gold by the U.S. government at $35 an ounce. Now, of course, the Federal Reserve, being a private bank and not answerable to the U.S. government, did in fact start overprinting paper dollars, which were sent to other nations around the world, and under Bretton Woods, they had to send back products and produce and raw materials at full value. And much of the perceived American prosperity of the 1950s and 60s was the result of these foreign nations having to send real raw materials, goods, produce, back to the United States in exchange for these little pieces of paper with ink all over them, because they were forced to accept these paper notes as being worth $35 per ounce of gold. Then in 1970, France started looking at this huge pile of printed paper notes sitting in their bank vaults, for which real French products like wine and cheese had been traded, and it notified the United States government that they would exercise their option under Bretton Woods to return all those paper notes for gold at the agreed-upon $35 per ounce exchange rate. The problem was the United States had nowhere near the gold to redeem all those paper notes. So on August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon temporarily, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, say no more, suspended gold convertibility of the U.S. Federal Reserve notes. This Nixon shock, as it was termed at the time, effectively ended Bretton Woods, and many global currencies started to delink from the U.S. dollar. And it created another problem, because the United States had been collateralizing their loans, money borrowed from other governments and foreign investors, with the American nation's gold reserves. And with the awareness that there wasn't enough gold to redeem all the Federal Reserve notes, lenders to the U.S. were starting to wonder, did the U.S. government have enough gold to collateralize their outstanding debts? Foreign nations began to get very nervous about the loans to the United States, and they were understandably reluctant to loan any additional money without some form of collateral. So what Richard Nixon did is he founded the environmental movement with the EPA and its various programs like wilderness zones and roadless areas and heritage rivers, wetlands, and all these other little different programs, which all took vast areas of public lands and made them off limits to the American people, who are technically the owner of all those lands. But Nixon had no concern for the environment, and the real purpose of this land grab, under the guise of the environment, was to pledge those pristine lands and their vast mineral resources as collateral on the outstanding national debt. The multitude of all these different programs was simply to conceal the scale of the land grab and collateralization of the American people's heritage. And it actually today covers almost 25% of the entire nation, is now locked up by these EPA programs and pledged as collateral on government borrowing. Now, with open lands, available lands for collateralization already in short supply, the U.S. government embarked on a new program to shore up sagging international demand for the dollar. The United States approached the world's oil-producing nations, mostly in the Middle East, and offered them a deal. In exchange for only selling their oil for dollars, the United States would guarantee the military safety of those oil-rich nations. The oil-rich nations would agree to spend and invest their U.S. paper dollars inside the United States, particularly in U.S. Treasury bonds, which would be redeemable through future generations of U.S. taxpayers. The concept was labeled the petrodollar. In effect, the United States, no longer able to back the dollar with gold, was now backing it with oil, other people's oil. And that necessity to keep control over those oil nations to prop up the dollar has dominated America's foreign policy in the region ever since. But as America's manufacturing and agriculture has declined, the oil-producing nations faced a dilemma. Like France, they've got piles and piles of these paper notes and treasury bonds piling up in their vaults, and there really wasn't all that much except real estate they wanted to buy from the United States of America. Europe's cars and aircraft were superior and less costly. In more recent times, America's experiment with GMO food crops has led a lot of nations to simply avoid buying U.S. agricultural exports. Israel's constant belligerence against its neighbors has caused the oil-producing nations to wonder if the U.S. could actually keep their end of the petrodollar arrangement. So oil-producing nations started to talk of selling their oil for whatever currency the purchasers wanted to pay. Iraq, already somewhat hostile to the United States following Desert Storm, demanded the right to sell their oil for euros in 2000. In 2002, the United Nations agreed that Iraq had a right to sell their oil for euros under the Oil for Food program. 1 year later, 2003, the United States reinvaded Iraq, lynched Saddam Hussein, and placed Iraq's oil back on the world market, only available for U.S. dollars. Now, the clear U.S. policy shift following 9/11, away from at least attempting to appear to be an impartial broker of peace in the Mideast to one of unquestioned support for Israel's aggressions, only further eroded confidence in the petrodollar deal, and even more oil-producing nations started openly talking of trading their oil for other global currencies. So over in Libya, Muammar Gaddafi had instituted a state central bank and a value-based trade currency, the gold dinar. Gaddafi then announced that Libya's oil was for sale, but only for the gold dinar. Other African nations, seeing the rise of the gold dinar and the euro, even as the U.S. dollar continued its inflation-driven decline, flocked to the new Libyan currency for trade. This move had the potential to seriously undermine the global hegemony of the dollar. French President Nicolas Sarkozy reportedly went so far as to call Libya a threat to the financial security of the world. So the United States invaded Libya under the guise of supporting a popular rebellion. They brutally murdered Gaddafi, apparently because the object lesson of Saddam's lynching had not been enough of a message, imposed a private central bank, and returned Libya's oil output to dollars only. The gold that was supposed to be made into the gold dinars, as of the last report I could find, unaccounted for. Now, according to General Wesley Clark, the master plan for the dollarification of the world's oil nations included 7 targets: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. Venezuela, which has started selling their oil to China for the yuan, seems to be a late addition. What is notable about those original 7 nations targeted by the U.S. is that none of them are members of the Bank of International Settlements. This is the private central banker's private central bank located in Switzerland. That meant that those 7 targeted nations were deciding for themselves how to run their nation's economies rather than submitting to the international private central bankers. Now, of course, the bankers' gun sights are on Iran, which dares to have a government central bank and sell their oil for whatever currency they choose. The war agenda for Iran is, as always, to force Iran's oil to be sold only for dollars and to force them to accept a privately owned central bank. Now, you have been raised by a public school system and a media that constantly assures you that the reasons for all these wars and assassinations are many and varied. We're bringing democracy to the conquered lands. We hear that a lot when actually the U.S. hasn't. The usual result of a U.S. overthrow is the imposition of a pro-business, pro-Wall Street, pro-U.S. dictatorship. Good example, the 1953 CIA overthrow of Iran's democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh and the imposition of the Shah. Or the 1973 CIA overthrow of Chile's elected government of President Salvador Allende and the imposition of the dictator Augusto Pinochet. Another one of the excuses we'll get is we have to save the people from a cruel oppressor. That's the one they're using in Syria right now. Revenge for 9/11. That was a big one going into Iraq. And then later on, President Bush was caught on video saying, no, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. And behind all of them, that tired, worn-out, catch-all excuse for invasion, weapons of mass destruction. Assassinations are always passed off as crazed lone nuts to obscure the real agenda. And the real agenda of the bankers is very simple. It is enslavement of the people by creation of a false sense of obligation. Now, that obligation is false because the private central banking system by design creates more debt than money with which to pay the debt. There is no way out the way it's set up. It's impossible to escape as long as you're playing by their rules. And you need to understand, private central banking is not science. It is a religion. It's a set of arbitrary rules created to benefit the priesthood, meaning the bankers, and it is supported only because people believe this is the way it's supposed to be. It is a religion. It's a set of arbitrary rules created to benefit the priesthood, meaning the owners of the private central banks. The fraud persists with often lethal results only because the people are brainwashed into believing that this is the way life is supposed to be, and no alternative exists or should even be dreamt of. Now, this same approach, the same brainwashing, was true of two earlier systems of enslavement, rule by divine right and slavery, both systems built to trick people into obedience, and both now recognized by modern civilization as illegitimate. So now we are on the verge of a new era in history where we will recognize that rule by debt, rule by private central bankers issuing the public currency as a loan at interest, is equally illegitimate. It only works as long as people allow themselves to believe that this is the way life is supposed to be. But you need to understand something that's the core of the issue. Private central banks do not exist to serve the people, the community, or the nation. Private central banks exist to serve their owners, to make them rich beyond the dreams of Midas, and all for the cost of ink, paper, and the right bribe to the right official, and the occasional assassination. But behind all these wars and all these assassinations, the 100 million plus horrible deaths from all of these wars, lies a single policy of financial dictatorship. The private central bankers only allow rulers to rule, only on the promise that the people of a nation be enslaved to the private central banks. Rulers who do not go along with that will be killed, their nation invaded by those other nations still enslaved to the private central banks. The bankers themselves don't fight these wars. Their children are not in these wars. A nation tries to break free of the private central bankers like Libya. All the other nations under the bankers' control pile on and destroy them. This so-called clash of civilizations you are being told about by the corporate media, it's really a war between banking systems, with the private central bankers forcing themselves onto the rest of the world, no matter how many millions must die for it. The constant hate-mongering against Muslims you see in the corporate media lies in a simple fact. Like the ancient Christians, prior to the Knights Templars, Muslims forbid usury or the lending of money at interest because they saw in ancient times, like Rome, how these banking practices could destroy an entire society. And that is the reason our government media insists that Muslims have to be hated and killed and converted. They refuse to submit to currencies loaned at interest. They refuse to be debt slaves. That makes them a threat to the natural order of the world, the new world order of global fascist dictatorship. So, off to war your children must go to spill their blood for the money junkies' gold. We barely survived the last two world wars. Now we're going into the third one in the nuclear bioweapon age. That is very dangerous. We have to ask ourselves, are the private central bankers willing to risk incinerating the whole planet to feed their greed? Apparently so. You as parents, as siblings, as spouses, need to ask yourself, do you really want to see your loved ones in uniform, killed and crippled, all for a bank balance sheet? But the whole point of this article, the whole point of what I'm sharing with you today, and this is all history, you can go out and hunt it down for yourself. Behind all the flag waving, behind all the propaganda, behind the crazed lone nut assassins, weapons of mass destruction, all of the modern wars this nation have fought are wars by and for the private bankers, fought and bled for by third parties unaware of the true reason they're expected to gracefully accept being killed and crippled for. And the process is quite simple. We've explained it before on this show. As soon as the private central bank issues its currency as a loan at interest, the public is forced deeper and deeper into debt. When the people are reluctant to borrow anymore, that's when the Keynesian economists demand the government borrow more to keep the pyramid scheme working. When both the people and the government refuse to borrow anymore, that is when the large wars get started, to plunge everyone even deeper to debt to pay for the war, and then after the war to borrow even more to rebuild. And when these horrible wars are over, the ordinary people have basically what they had before the war, except their graveyards are a lot larger, and everyone is in debt to the private bankers for the next century. That is why Brown Brothers Harriman in New York was funding the rise of Adolf Hitler, because war is the bankers' richest harvest. We all need to recognize this is what all these wars have been about. Private central banking, enlarging their domain, imposing their will on nations that do not want it, imposing their system on the rulers of nations who do not want it. Bribery, blackmail, assassination, they will do anything to maintain their stranglehold on the productivity of the world's people. And as long as private central banks are allowed to exist, inevitably, as the night follows the day, there will be poverty, hopelessness, millions of deaths in endless world wars until the earth itself is sacrificed in flames to Mammon. The path to true world peace lies in the abolishment of all private central banking everywhere, and a return to the state-issued, value-based currencies that allow nations and people to become prosperous through their own labor and development and efforts. Now, I mentioned the Knights Templars. Prior to the Knights Templars, Christianity, like Islam, forbade usury because Christianity, much of Orthodox Christianity, came out of Rome, and they had seen firsthand what debt-based economies do, even to the Roman Empire. They'd seen it firsthand. So they had a ban on usury. And the Knights Templars were able to basically either bribe or blackmail the Pope to get a special dispensation that allowed them to rent money, is what they called it. They didn't call it usury, they called it renting money. A lot of modern predatory banking practices were pioneered by the Knights Templars. And they plunged Europe into hopelessly unpayable debt until finally French King Philip IV, otherwise known as Philip the Fair, did the only solution he could do. Because he understood, as long as you believed in the rules of the bankers, as long as you played by the rules they created to serve themselves, you are hopelessly trapped. And so Philip thought outside the box, and I know he's demonized for it, but in looking at the history of the Templars, it was his last resort. He sent messages to all of the regions in France, secret orders on the same time, in the same moment, on the same day. All of the Templars were arrested, and their commanderies, which is what they called their banks, were broken into, looking for looted wealth. They didn't find a lot of it. It was a paper empire, just like the Federal Reserve is. It's all based on paper. There's nothing of any real value there. It's all paper notes. And he sent the Templars to prison and execution, except for Scotland and Portugal, where the Pope and King Philip IV really didn't have a lot of control. I think that the governments of the world, looking at the situation, looking how close we are to seeing this current world conflict emerge into a full-blown global thermonuclear war, that maybe they need to start thinking about the wisdom of King Philip the Fair and say it's time to simply grab all these private central bankers all at the same time so they can't simply skedaddle from one nation to another and come back and try the same thing again, as they will inevitably do, because these people are addicts. They're hopelessly addicted to other people's money. It's why we call them money junkies. When we see somebody who's addicted to cocaine or methamphetamine or heroin, and we can easily see how they're destroying their home and community around them. Now we need to look at these money addicts and look at how they're destroying the entire world around them. And it's time for an intervention. It's time for us to become private central banking heretics, to stop believing that this is the way life is supposed to be. Because it isn't. It isn't even the way the United States was actually started. And they're trying as hard. Look at the destruction of our nation. We used to be the world's greatest nation. Now the most generous estimate is we're down to number 16 and still falling. And yet, despite the destruction to our nation, its infrastructure, its children, its quality of medical care, the quality of its manufacturing output, we still are compelled somehow to go out and force this same banking system onto the rest of the world at the point of a bayonet. Does that make any sense at all? Not to a rational human being. To a money junkie, yeah, it's perfect. But we're really at a crisis point in history. And the first step to resolving that crisis, to not let it go any further into a potential nuclear war, is to recognize that private central banking, ruled by manufactured illusion of debt, is no more legitimate a system of governance than rule by divine right or rule by slavery. We all need to recognize the true cause of all the pain and suffering and wars. It's not the terrorists, it's not Al-Qaeda. These are just distractions and set pieces put in front of your eyes so you can't see the very clear pattern behind much of modern human history. It's a war of banking systems, with the predatory private central banks seeking to eradicate any nation and any ruler that would dare
herännyt globaaliin tietoisuuteen. Eli
Eli me ollaan nyt Kanta-Hämeen keskussairaalan pihalla. On Teemu Vehkala haastattelussa. Hei Teemu, sä oot nyt ollut täällä Kanta-Hämeen keskussairaalan suljetulla osastolla helmikuun puolivälistä lähtien. Voisitko sä kertoa, mitä sä päädyit tänne?
Päädyin tänne silleen, että mä olin laivalla soittajana, eli tein freelancena muusikohommia. Ja tehtiin kahta laivaa. Me tehtiin ensin Turussa 2 matkaa tuossa Tallikki Galaxy. Ja meni hyvin. Sitten me mentiin Helsinkiin ja tuli Viking Expressin, mikä menee Tallinnan ja Helsingin välillä. Mentiin sitä sitten siinä 4 päivää, kunnes tapahtui tää torstai 17. vai oliko se 16.2. tai torstai päivä. Niin sitten tapahtui jotain omituista, että kahvin sekaan joku oli tiputtanut sitten LSD-tyyppistä huumetta sinne sekaan. Mikä sitten aiheutti semmoisen reaktion, että mä syljin käteen, niin sylke meni kädestä läpi. Ja sitten mä menin siitä sitten ilmoittamaan laivan sinne infotiskille. Infotiskillä ne katsoi, että toi on ihan sekaisin nyt. Ja tuli laivapoliisi kehi. Laivapoliisi oli sitten sitä mieltä, että tätä kaveria ei voi pistää hyttiin, koska voi olla itselle vaaraksi. Mentiin bändikaverin hyttiin ja kysyttiin, että voiko täällä tulla niin hänen hyttiinsä yöksi. Ei käynyt. Putka oli se ainut vaihtoehto. Ja sitten kun siinä aamu valkeeni, niin laivan lääkäri haastattelee minua ja sanoo, että teillä on psykoosi, te tarvitsette ammattimaista hoitoa. Ja sitten kun laiva tuli satamaan, niin aamiaisen jälkeen mut karkotettiin laivassa ja vietiin suoraan ambulanssi, joka ajoi Helsingissä on yksikköön. Ja siellä sitten haastateltiin lyhyesti just tämmöisiä mielenterveellisiä taustoja, onko tällaisia olemassa. Ja siinä sitten tuli ambulanssikyyti tänne Hämeenlinnaan. Tähän näin. Tuonne Rapu eteen tuli ambulanssi. Ja mut vietiin suljetulla osastolla.
Selvä. Onko sulla niinku mitään aiempaa merkintää psyykkisistä ongelmista? Ootko sä saanut aiemmin hoitoa tai ollut lääkityksen alasena?
En.
Onko sulla koskaan tuomittu väkivaltaisesta käyttäytymisestä?
Ei
Onko sulla koskaan ollut itsetuhoisia taipumuksia?
Ei oo.
Okei, selvä. Mitä sä niinku viedät sun päivät? Et kerro vähän sun niinku peruspäivästä, että mitä sun vapautta rajoitetaan täällä?
No sitä rajoitetaan sillä tavalla, että ulkona voi kulkea 3 tuntia päivässä maan tiettynä kellon väleinä, että aamu 10 aamu 11 tai sitten iltapäivällä 2-3 ja illalla 6-7. Sillä lailla sitä rajoitetaan.
Okei. Miten sua kohdellaan täällä laitoksessa? Miten laitoshenkilökunta suhtautuu suhun?
Se suhtautuu minuun kuten muihinkin potilaisiin, eli se pitää hulluna eikä usko sitä mun tarinaa, että mut huumattiin laivalla. Ja
aivan.
Mä pidän niinku paranoidisesti, jopa skitsofreenisenä täällä laitossa.
Okay.
Sen leiman on saanut.
Miten poliisi tai hallinto-oikeus on suhtautunut tuohon tapaukseen? Että
hallinto-oikeus lyttäsi sen jutun ensimmäisessä vaiheessa ja siellä sanottiin vaan, että Vehkala on saanut asianmukaista hoitoa ja bla bla bla. Poliisissa sitten esitutkintaa ei tehty, koska sanottiin, että ei ole tarpeeksi näyttöä.
Järkyttävää. Siis tää on oikeesti tosi järkyttävää ja pelottavaa, että niinku Suomessa tapahtuu tällaista niinku
niinhän se on.
vaihtamista.
Ja mä tiesin itse tämän blogin homman, että jopa siellä laivalla laivalla enteille, että jotain tämmöistä tapahtuu, että
joo.
mielisairaalaa tarkoitetaan.
Miten sä itse koet sen, että niinku Suomessa rajoitetaan sananvapautta näin?
Kyllä se mun mielestä paljastaa sen, että aika törkeitä sananvapausrikkomuksia on tällaiset tapaukset. Ja tiedän kuitenkin, en ole ainoa, joka on tämmöisen kokenut, että yksi toinenkin aktivisti tuolta Turusta oli kanssa hoidettu suljetulla. Ja hän oli kanssa kansalaisaktivipiireissä hyvin aktiivinen.
Okei. Siirrytään vähän muihin aiheisiin. Eli sä oot tosiaan kirjoitellut aktiivisesti netissä vuodesta 2006 ja sä oot tämän suositun nettiblogin Havaintoja uudesta maailmanjärjestyksestä pitäjä. Sun blogissa sä tiedotat maailman tapahtuvista asioista, joista valtavirta media ei uutisoi. Miksi sä luulet, että niin media ei uutisoi niistä asioista, mistä sä kirjoitat sun blogissa?
Se johtuu siitä, koska jos media rupeaisi julkaisemaan näitä juttuja uutisina, niin tapahtuu hyvin nopeasti semmoinen juttu, että ihmisten kollektiivinen tietoisuus purkautuisi. Eli tavallaan sitten hyvin monen ihmisen kollektiivinen tietoisuus alkaisi rikkoutumaan siinä, että vanginvartijatietoisuus hajoaa. Itse asiassa samoin tällä blogilla niin, ja monet muut bloggaajat on saanut myös sitä aikaan ihmisissä. Että heissä on tietoisuus rikkoutunut. Se on sitten se niin globaalille eliitille tämmöinen ilmiö on hyvinkin vahingollinen, koska jokainen yksilö, joka herää siitä kollektiivisesta tietoisuudesta, niin ei ole enää tavallaan kontrolloitavissa.
Uskot sä, että meihin kohdistuu tälläkin hetkellä niinku aivopesua?
Kyllä, ihan koko ajan.
Okei, eli
mainoksissa ja televisiosarjoissa ja ihan koko ajan.
Valtavirtamusiikissa?
Myös sielläkin.
Joo, okei. Voisitko sä kertoa, että mitä tarkoitetaan tällä termillä uusi maailmanjärjestys ja miksi tietyt tahot tahtoo rajoittaa niin näistä asioista tiedottavia lähteitä?
No, siis uusi maailmanjärjestys on se, että maailman maat yhdentyy, Eurooppa yhdentyy tällä hetkellä lähinnä velkakriisipaketeilla sitten saadaan maiden itsenäisyys ajettua veke ja lopulta sitten perustetaan yksi liittovaltio. Ja sen takana on suuret korporaatiot, suuret suuryhtiöt, koska niiden etuja ne ajaa. Sitten kaikki tämmöinen ilmastopankki liittyy ihan samaan asiaan.
Joo. Elikkä on niinku käytännössä olisi vain yksi niinku iso poliisivaltio maailmassa ja yksi maailman valuutta ja yksi maailman hallitus.
Kyllä.
Selvä.
Sitä ollaan tällä hetkellä Lähi-idässä tekemässä.
Joo, eikö tämä globalisaatio ole se termi, jolla tämä niinku nykyään tapahtuu?
Kyllä se on, koska globalisaatio on hyvä sana, koska eliitti on itse globalisteja.
Joo. Ja miten niinku tällaisessa niinku voisi hyvin kuvitella, että jos on yksi tällainen iso poliisivaltio, niin oikeastaan mihinkään ei pääse karkuun. Et eikö se niinku yksityisyyttä ei olisi enää?
Joo, ja sitten se on semmoinen vaan ilmianto poliisille, niin poliisi käy noukkimassa tulevaisuudessa kaikki tämmöiset kapinoitsijat.
Joo.
Se on niinku poliisin virka-apua tullaan hyödyntämässä tässä uudessa maailmanjärjestyksessä.
Joo. Oletko mitä mieltä itse tästä mikrosiru-ilmiöstä, mikä niinku tapahtuu nyt muun muassa Yhdysvalloissa, että ihmisiin tungetaan näitä mikrosiruja?
No siis se on se, mikä kehitys on edessä. Se on jo päätetty, että uuden maailmanjärjestyksen ihmiset tullaan mikrosirustamaan. Se on ajat sitten päätetty jo. Se on ihan päivän ajan kysymys, milloinkin se tulee esimerkiksi EU:ssa pakolliseksi direktiivistä nämä sirut.
Elikkä tällä sirulla olisi niinku kaikki sun henkilötiedot ja muun muassa sun rahat, että sä maksasit sillä sirulla. Ja se olisi toisaalta tosi kätevää, mutta pystyykö tämän sirun kautta muun muassa jäljittämään ihmisen?
Pystyy nimenomaan. Ja se siinä on yksityisyyttä siellä rikkovaa.
Mä itse katoin tällaisen Rockefellerin entisen ystävän haastattelun ja hän sanoi siinä, että joo, ja hän sanoi siinä, kertoi, että jos on tällainen siru, niin jos sulla on kaikki rahat siinä sirulla ja jos sä alat niinku protestoimaan niinku nykyistä hallitusta vastaan, niin ei niiden tarvitse muuta kuin niinku laittaa sun siru pois päältä. Sä et pysty ostamaan mitään, sä et pysty ostamaan ruokaa ja se on aika huono tilanne.
Just näin.
Joo. Mitä sä itse luulet olevan tämän sun tapauksen takana? Et niinku, yrittääkö tietyt tahot niinku musertaa sua henkisesti?
Kyllä, tää mielisairaala olosuhde on nimenomaan se, että henkisesti yrittää murentaa ja lääkkeet on kanssa vahvat reseptit päällä. Leponexia ja Ratiofarm, Olanzafinia ja...
Siis pakko syötetäänkö sulle lääkkeitä?
Kyllä.
Vaikka sä oot täysin terve eikä sulla ole mitään niinku...
Joo, kyllä se lääkkeiden pakkolääkintä on täällä niin, tässä paikassa.
No mitä tapahtuu, jos sä et niinku syö niitä?
Jos se syö lääkkeitä, jos mä sanon niille tällaiset, mennään piikillä.
Elikkä sun tunnetaan piikkiä?
Joo, piikki tunnetaan, jos ei niitä lääkkeitä syö. Niin se menee täällä.
Elikkä sulle pakko syötetään näitä lääkkeitä täällä, niin mitä lääkkeitä sulle annetaan?
Mulla annetaan semmoista kuin Leponexia, Olanzapin Ratiofarmia, sitten Temesta rauhoittavaa.
Joo. Tiedät sä määriä?
En pysty kyllä. Olanzapin Ratiofarmia se oli 20 milligrammaa vuorokaudessa ja sitä Leponexia oli kyllä vähän enemmän. Muistamaan.
Miten sä oot huomannut, miten nuo lääkkeet vaikuttaa suhun tai miten sä oot huomannut sun voinnissa niinku eroa?
No siis ensinnäkin Leponex niistä semmonen lääke, mikä aiheuttaa rintakipuja. Tiedän, että Leponexiin on 4 vuotta joku potilas vetänyt sitä naamarin on kuollut, sydän on pettänyt. Sitten taas toi muut antipsykoottiset lääkkeet, niin tekee semmoista ilmiöitä, että tunteettomuutta. Turtuu nimenomaan, että tavallaan ajattelu on paljon vaikeampaa.
Aivan.
Eihän niiden tarkoituksena mitään muuta ole kuin hiljentää noille lääkkeille.
Aivan. Mutta hyvä, että ne on niin paljon hiljentänyt vielä.
Se oli silloin kun tänne tuli, niin ne antoi semmoisen 3 piikillistä perseeseen diapamia.
Joo.
Se oli semmoinen annos, että siinä oli seuraavat 2 vuorokautta tämmöisessä tilassa. Käsi heilu näin. Se oli se kun tänne tuli, niin rätkästiin tuonne putkaa ja 15 miestä seisoi mun päällä siellä putkassa. Ei suostunut lähteä pois siinä.
Elikkä sä oot niinku nyt joutunut huumausainerikoksen kohteeksi, sun sananvapauttas on rikostu, sut on diagnosoitu mielisairaaksi, sut on suljettu pakkohoitoon ja sulle syötetään niinku vahvoja psyykelääkkeitä. Minkälainen sun vointi on?
Kyllä mä voin silti sanoa, että mun vointi on ihan hyvä.
Joo.
Sitten en mä tässä henkisesti millään lailla nujertunut tai...
Joo. Se on tosi hieno asia kuulla. Sä oot kuitenkin jossain määrin niin ylläpitänyt silti tätä blogia.
Joo.
Et sitä ei ole vielä suljettu.
Mulla on ihan täys oikeesti kirjoittaa, että mä en oo mitään rikollista tehnyt.
Nimenomaan, sä et oo mitään väärää tehnyt. Onks oot sä miettinyt, että sä tekisit jonkun toisen samanlaisen blogin tai siltä varalta, jos tää nykyisen blogi suljetaan, niin onko sulla mitään varasuunnitelmaa?
Ei oo käynyt mielessä mitään.
Okei. Tietyt henkilöt, kun mä oon nyt seurannut tätä keskustelua, muun muassa tämän adressin kommentteja, niin tietyt henkilöt on niinku kieltäytynyt uskomasta, niinku, että tällaista tapahtuu, ja ne vaatii niinku todisteita, niin onko sulla näille ihmisille jotain sanottavaa?
No, ne on semmosia ihmisiä, jotka itse ei näe niitä todisteita, koska ne todisteethan on olemassa. Ihan kaikki blogissa kirjoitut jutut toimii todisteena siinä. Että
Joo.
Kyllä tää Suomessa on ihan mahdollista, että jos kirjoittelet uudesta maailmanjärjestöstä kritisoivaan sävyyn, niin kritisoit tätä globaalia eliittiä, niin ei siinä kauan aikaa mene, kun tapahtuu tälleen jollekin muillekin tyypeille. Nimenomaan se on ollut se syy, että toi blogi on tavoittanut niin monta ihmistä, yksilöitä, jotka on tavallaan herännyt globaaliin tietoisuuteen.
Siitä sun blogista on tullut niinku tällainen uhka näille tahoille.
Joo, jossain mielessä suuret tahot ei pidä semmoisesta.
Joo.
Siellä on sitten omat toimeksiantajat, jotka hoitaa tämmöisiä temppuja huumeilla, että niissä ei supollakaan ole mitään tekemistä.
Aivan. Miten niinku ihmiset vois auttaa sua pääsemään niinku pois täältä?
Kyllä tuo adressi on yksi hyvä juttu.
Joo.
Sitten se, että pääsee avohoidon piiriin vielä täältä, että pääsee täältä paikasta pois.
Aivan.
Voi olla yötkin kuin himassa.
Aivan. Elikkä tosiaan netissä on adressit.com, on Vapauttakaa Teemu Vehkala adressi, käykää allekirjoittamassa se. No miten niinku ihmisten pitäisi suhtautua tähän uuteen maailmanjärjestykseen ja siihen liittyviin asioihin?
No siis uusi maailmanjärjestys on se, että missä mitään yksityisyyttä ei ole kenelläkään ihmisellä. Että laitetaan mikrosilut joka ihmiseen ja isoveli valvoo koko ajan. Ja ihan niin kuin toi aikanaan tää yksi kuuluisa kirjailija Jenkeissä sanoi, että monet ihmiset tulevat kuolemaan taistellessaan uutta maailmanjärjestystä vastaan. Eli se on semmoinen juttu, että se uusi maailmanjärjestys tulee vaikka 2013. Ja se tosiaan meinaa sitä, että Suomessakin tulee sitten uudet mellakkapoliisit sitä varten.
se on siinä. Varastusvaimen täältä ohi. Tämä Emeli istuu vaikka sinne. Niin. Oho. Anna mä istun tähän. Onks mulla täällä? Ai mulla on täällä lähetys käynnissä. Laitetaan lähetys pois päältä. Vaihteeksi.